Good day, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, MDR, Top Things You Need to Know as a Packaging Engineer. I'm Anneke Willems, and I'll be your moderator today. We have just a few brief announcements before we begin. This webinar is designed to be interactive. In the right bottom of your screen, you have the opportunity to click Chat and Q&A. If you're experiencing any technical problems, please use the chat function so that we can do our best to assist you. And we would like to ask you to use the Q&A function to ask questions that relate to the content of the presentation. You can check a box to make sure your question is asked anonymously if you prefer that. Now on to the presentation. Discussing today's topic are Geoff Pavey, Technical Fellow, Technology Manager based in the United States, and Tommy Smith, Principal Technical Engineer based in Ireland. I will now turn it to Tommy to begin.
Hey, thanks, Anneke. So hello, everybody. I hope you're all doing very well. So yeah, my name is Tommy Smith. Just to give you a brief background on myself, I have 9 years experience in the flexible packaging business. Prior experience at Steripack and Bemis Healthcare Packaging, degree in polymer science and a PhD in polymer engineering. Also presenting today is Geoff Pavey. So Geoff comes with a massive amount of experience, 29 plus years. He's got significant knowledge on sterile barrier packaging of materials and also design. Geoff also holds a degree in packaging from the Michigan State University. So just to kind of run through our agenda today, we're going to talk to you on a high level, so general information on MDR. We're going to talk about some key high-level topics, our experiences, and kind of what we're seeing in the field. And then we're going to look at the connection of this MDR initiative with ISO 11607 as well. So I suppose just to point out to everybody, myself and Geoff, we're engineers, we're not regulatory people, we're not lawyers or in any case fit or form of that. But we wanted to put this MDR together today to give you guys an insight from our perspective. So really it's from an engineer's perspective. So it will be probably different to what you usually would be used to hearing from a regulatory group or regulatory teams, but we hope it'll be really good insight for you. So I think before we really kick off, we'd like to do a poll. So the poll basically is, what is your experience with MDR so far? So we're going to give you the opportunity now to select one of the three. And because there's a large volume of people on the call, it'll be nice for us all to be able to, I suppose, have an idea of what the group thinks of MDR today. So the first option is it clear to me what the changes are and how I should adjust my packaging? Option 2 is, I have an idea of what the general changes are, but find it difficult to implement them in my packaging. And then finally, it's unclear what the impact is to my packaging. So you've got the next 10 seconds or 15 seconds or so just to go ahead and select that, and then we'll give you that live poll. Okay, so here we see the results. So we've got 9% saying it's clear to me what the changes are and how I should adjust. We've got 53% saying I have an idea, but I'm finding it difficult to implement them into my packaging, which is very interesting. And then finally, we've got 38% of you saying that it's unclear to me what the impact is to my packaging. So from my perspective, this is exactly what we're seeing currently in the field. There's not much of a shift here. It really is relying on the latter two. So that's a really interesting poll. So at least we all know we're all in the one boat. So as we know, MDR was launched in April 2017, and it is to replace the MDD. So the European Commission has initiated the process to postpone the MDR implementation, and we feel this is the correct decision. So by postponing the implementation, it'll give everybody, the focus that they need right now on this pandemic, and to be able to be better focused. So the MDD will be valid for 1 more year. However, It has been enacted in the past week by the Parliament and by the Council. So the Commission has also decided to harmonise several revised standards against the MDD, and they have also declared that the list of Medical Device Directives harmonised standards are valid until 2024. So it's important to note that MDR is coming, and the efforts to comply must continue, because just because we've got a year of a gap waiting, that doesn't mean we shouldn't continue. So we should definitely continue on the road that we're on to try and be MDR compliant by that date. The four main categories, for medical devices, as we all know, are safety, packaging, quality systems, and risk. Today's webinar really will focus on our packaging, because that's, I suppose, our forte, and that's what we know well. So just bear that in mind, that MDR, I'm sure Geoff is going to go through this, it's very, very broad, but for today's webinar, it'll be focused on packaging. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Geoff. So Geoff, I'll leave it with you.
Thanks, Tommy. Again, just to oversimplify the MDR as well, we've kind of bucketed it into four categories: safety and environment, packaging, quality, and risk assessment. The safety and environment really covers areas like REACH and CLP, classification and labeling of hazardous materials, and packaging of hazardous materials. The packaging portion really kind of aligns with ISO 11607. The quality aligns with the quality systems and ISO 1345. And risk is really kind of different these days, because it really looks at a life cycle approach and really emphasizes on post-market surveillance. And risk is also covered under your 1345 assessment, but also there are additional guidances on risk in other ISO documents like 14971. So, and again, trying to even simplify the medical device regulation further, it really has the overall objective of the medical device regulations really, for number one reason, is to increase patient safety. Not only increase patient safety to the patients, but also the people that are using the devices and that are interacting with devices and packaging. So that's kind of the main focus. The other focus is, that's kind of new, is to hold notified bodies more accountable. And with that in mind, talking about the notified bodies, in Chapter 4, there's a whole chapter in MDR related to notified bodies. And in Chapter 4, it starts talking about that the member states shall designate authorities responsible for the notified bodies. And these authorities are responsible for the assessment and designation for notified bodies. And what that means at a high level is that the MDR is enforcing more requirements on the notified bodies and their continued qualification assessment. And so what that means is that they're being held more accountable, and that means that they're likely to scrutinize medical device manufacturers more, and medical device manufacturers are going to be more conservative in what they do. Now, focusing on other high-level MDR changes, one is Section 11 on infection and microbial contamination. In 11.1 says the devices and manufacturer processes shall be designed to eliminate or reduce as far as possible the risk of infection to users and patients. And really, under this section, there are really two new concepts under Section B and Section D, and that is Section B to allow for ease and safe handling, and D to prevent microbial contamination of the device. And so what this is doing is really emphasizing at a high level that aseptic presentation. And so emphasizing on opening features of packaging and aseptic technique and presentation. In Section 11.4 is another high-level change, and it talks about the integrity of packaging needs to be clearly evident to the final user at the point of use. Now, again, keep it in mind that the high-level purpose of the MDR is to increase patient safety. And if you think about it, integrity of the packaging, and to be clearly evident, there's a lot of things that we already do in the medical device industry to design packages to make that work. And one of the things is our seal transfer or witness marks for seal integrity. That's already designed into it and also helps to reduce the risk to patients. This is also another opportunity with the emphasis of this to take the chance to educate users regarding packaging defects too. So there's another opportunity for us. This section also is highlighting the handling of packages in a hospital environment and trying to understand the packaging dynamics a little bit better. And that's why you'll hear terminology in the industry a lot these days, like the last mile, 1,000 feet, 100 yards, is, people are using that terminology to start to understand and classify that, that portion of the packaging life cycle. And there's an increased focus and attention on hospital handling and storage, which when we take a look at that further, it might drive more packaging changes.
Hey, Geoff, I really think this slide is important. So can we dig a little deeper on what customers are currently doing with their information, and then what will be expected, what they'll be expected, I suppose, once MDR is actually live next year?
Well, like the web, or like this slide says, is it really, and if you look at the changes in the MDR, there really are no changes regarding packaging and packaging validation, but it really emphasizes it more often, and it really puts a highlight on the fact that packaging engineers need to realize that the proof of packaging validation is going to be increased, and the demand for that is going to be increased. So that means anybody that has sterile barrier systems or preformed sterile barrier systems are going to be asked more questions about to have some kind of proof of evidence for packaging validation, which can mean as simply as, hey, I have documented the actual nomenclature for the packaging validation, or that I actually have the full packaging validation available to me.
But that's kind of as it is today, like nothing really has changed as such.
Correct. Just like I said, more of an emphasis on, hey, you need to prove that this is happening more so, and people are going to ask those questions more often.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Another change that has been talked about in the industry as well and highlighted is in section 23.3, information on the packaging. And really, this really starts to emphasize the new labeling requirements. And some new ones are sections A, H, and J. A being an indication of a sterile packaging, and we'll show an example of what that means. But basically saying that you have to show, put indications on the packaging or labeling that says that this package is sterile. The manufacturing date, instructions for what to do when the packaging has been compromised. This is similar to now the pharmaceutical industry. So when you make a bottle of aspirin or something and it says on the wrap or the cap, do not use if the packaging is damaged in some form or another. So that these are going to basically drive more artwork changes as well. And then, in addition, one of the key ones in the industry is talked about in section 11.8, the addition of symbols on the packaging required to show the differences between the sterile and non-sterile parts or components of the packaging. This means basically the new proposal is based on ovals, and if you have a solid oval, it is an indication of a sterile barrier, or that barrier that is designed to maintain the sterility, or a dashed line, which indicates a protective packaging. And thanks to organizations like the Sterile Barrier Association, they've come up with guidance documents on these symbols and you know, gives you some ideas of how to apply the symbols with different types of packaging.
Geoff, sorry, no, just another question for you on this. Is there a specific location on the packaging where the symbol is to be placed? So, like for instance, is it to be on the top, bottom, left, or right, or has that been discussed?
So, as far as the the MDR, it doesn't say what location on the package where it needs to be actually, but it does say that. Here's an example of what we talked about earlier that needs to have a symbol that says that the package is sterile, and it kind of makes sense too that when you're using the sterile barrier system symbol, it needs to be in association with that sterile indicator. So therefore, it just has to be in the proximity of the labeling that says it is sterile. So going through historically and thinking, why is this SBS symbol really important? And working with a lot of customers over the years, this has been a struggle when they become aware of the fact that sometimes the packaging systems are not sterile, or they haven't been designed to be sterile in some format or another. So we wanted to just give you an example of historically how this has been addressed and why this SBS symbol is really good. So historically, for example, the sterile barrier system, like a Tyvek Pouch, for example, it goes, you package your device in that packaging configuration of a pouch, for example, and then you send that through and get it sterilized. But since the device is sensitive to oxygen or gas transmission, you need to put that in a foil pouch as an outer barrier and a protective barrier. Since it's unclear in that double packaging configuration that the outside of the inner pouch, the Tyvek pouch, then that means that the end user, when they open the pouch, they don't know if they can put that pouch into a sterile field or not. So one of the ways that one of our historical customers did says, well, let's identify that on the outside of the pouch, which is great, but you can also see that they had to do that in multiple languages and take up a lot of space. And the best way that they could describe it was saying, this is not a sterile barrier. This is not a sterile barrier is kind of confusing to what part of the package system still is. So therefore, the symbology is really valuable now versus historically.
Hey Geoff, you know, like from a European perspective, you know, I have a lot of customers. You know, they're trying to figure this all out, and they're trying to carve through, you know, what this is about and what MDR means for their business. You know, and as we all know, it's very bespoke in that it depends on what their business is. So not one thing fits all, I suppose. But I think the next few slides around interpretation and application of MDR, from looking at them last night, will be a really good example.
So likewise, in the U.S. and other parts of the world, Tony, we get the same types of questions, and because we're all trying to figure out, you know, how to apply it and go through this together. Some of the examples that I share with you and the rest of the group is, you know, people are asking how to apply the symbology of SBS systems, and also there's a lot more discussions around aseptic presentation and what that means. So for example, for the symbology, think about the purpose. The end purpose is really designed for the end user and to identify what is sterile and what's not sterile. But I know that we've had discussions with customers that think that it needs to be put on every single packaging type of configuration. And where it doesn't make a lot of sense, or it doesn't really meet the end application intent, is where you have work in progress, or you have a non-functional device that's just a component. Those types of designations of whether they're sterile or not sterile should be really in specifications, and the symbols are not required for those applications. But if you want to, you always can have the choice if you want to apply this to those applications, but it's not really required.
Yes, so Geoff, I really like this slide as well because, from my perspective, again, I'm looking at it from a European perspective. I get a lot of questions on, the usability evaluation for the aseptic presentation, and time after time, we've got customers coming in and they're really kind of confused about what that actually means for them. Are you seeing that as well on your side?
Yes, we actually have a lot of customers that are talking about, and again, in this slide, we put it together here that, the connection with ISO 11607, the reason why Section 7 and ISO 11607 for usability evaluation for aseptic presentation was put in there is to harmonize it with the medical device regulation. And that's causing a lot of people to start to think about, well, how do I address this now since it is a packaging requirement, an international packaging requirement? And those discussions really wind up with customers. We have to really kind of sort things out and talk through it. And those really focus on two things, is that people are combining both microbial and particulate contamination, and also combining that with peel strength and versus the user experience. So in these discussions with customers, kind of walk through and talk through the fact that what is microbial versus particulate, and as far as aseptic presentation, and basically put the definition, the ISO definition out there of aseptic presentation, meaning the transfer of sterile contents from its sterile barrier system using conditions and procedures that minimize the risk of microbial contamination. So that emphasizes the fact that if you have particulate, it does not mean that it's a microbial contaminant. And so therefore, you can have sterile particulate, you can have particulate that has microbial or potential of microbes attached to it as well. But just because you have particulate does not mean that it is a microbial contamination. So we first have to establish that foundation of what aseptic presentation means and start to think about it in deeper. And then the second part is really when people are trying to think about usability and how that affects aseptic presentation, then they start associating it with common things that they do every day. For example, peel strength. Peel strength according to ASTM F88, which is a coupon perpendicular measurement to a seal of the seal strength. Well, that is a way to assess the seal strength and to keep it and monitor it, right? But the user experience is really based on not actually peel strength. And I will argue the fact that the most influential factor is not necessarily the peel strength, but it's actually the design of the package. And its designs, the two most influential designs for the user, or designs of packaging, the user, are features like the width of the seal. So you can have the exact same seal strength in F88, but if you change the width of the seal, it changes the user's experience significantly. And then other features, pouches and other types of packaging configurations as well that have chevron designs and corner peel designs, those are all designed to make it easier opening features of those packaging and help the user experience be better. So peel strength is not the number one focus. And so when we start talking about those and how we can design packages better using the same peel strength or then per F88, that kind of discussions are the discussions that we have. And it really is an eye-opening experience when we combine all those together and under those true understandings and intentions of the document.
Interesting, yeah.
So like I kind of touched base on a little bit before too, kind of tying it into ISO 11607. So the medical device regulation changes cause the ISO 11607 documents to become disharmonized. And in doing so, the ISO groups, packaging work group, got together and incorporated and reviewed it and incorporated the key elements of the medical device regulation into ISO 11607. That updated or harmonized document was published in the first quarter of last year. And yet the feedback from the European Commission is really, it's good, but we really don't agree with the risk management section. So it's really not harmonized because of the risk management, but everything else was good. And so therefore, after the ISO working group gets through finishing the technical information report on how to interpret ISO 11607, after they finish that, working on that document, then they're going to go back and work on amending the risk management to make it more unified with the European Commission. Now, some people, we've been told that some people think that to resolve that conflict of the risk management, people they can use EN 868 to resolve that, and that's not the case. EN 868 are just examples of ways to, EN 868 2 through 10 are just ways to show compliance with ISO 11607. They're not going to mitigate the risk better than the document itself. And kind of a summary of the high-level changes we talked about. Notified bodies, we're expecting them to scrutinize medical device manufacturers more. And then again, medical device manufacturers are going to be more conservative. It means that they're going to, dive deeper into audits and reviews, and medical device manufacturers are going to start to dive deeper too as well. Secondly, increase analysis on hospital handling and storage, and to start understanding what those packaging dynamics are. Additionally, again, the highlight and the focus again on aseptic presentation. It's been in the industry for a long time and a focus, but now it's getting more attention as well. And increased demands for validation documentation. As I pointed out earlier, it is in two parts of the regulation now, talks about validation documentation. So expect to have more inquiries along those lines as well. And then definitely labeling changes and artwork changes as well. Now, some of the label changes, we only touched briefly on some of the key labeling changes, but there are a lot more labeling changes than we covered today.
Geoff, I just have actually one more question on that. Sorry there. It's a question that's actually come in, and it's asking about the size of the label. So I asked you about the location of it. So does it have to be, I asked you, does it matter if it's the top or the bottom or the left or the right? But is there an actual minimum size for the label? It's the sterile barrier symbol. Do we know?
Not to my knowledge. But if you think about that from a practical sense, is that to say that it needs to have one size, we know that packaging sizes and shapes are from very small to very large, and to try and fit, and that the packaging real estate or the amount of area on a package is is getting more and more challenging. So to say that it has to be a very specific size doesn't make sense, and I haven't found anything that says that it has to be a specific size.
It's probably just once it's legible, yeah, on the packaging.
You're right. Legibility is the key, and is one of the key requirements for any kind of labeling or artwork.
And then just another quick one then on the symbols again. It's a question came in here asking, is it compulsory? Now, it was my understanding that it's probably not compulsory until it goes live May of next year. I think the question is it compulsory now? The symbols.
And I understand it the same way that there's a date when you are required. It was going to be May of this year, but it's postponed to next year. But think about that plus all the other labeling changes that you're going to have to make. You're going to have to, if you're doing your own artwork, or if you have a supplier doing your artwork, you got to go through those artwork changes and approvals process. You might want to get a head start on doing it earlier than later.
Gotcha. Sorry for hijacking your slide, Geoff.
No worries. And some of the key takeaways that we want to cover too is that for packaging, in particular for medical device, terminally sterilized medical devices, really, let's focus on the global standard, ISO 11607, and make sure that we're focusing on that. And it already has in that document a lot of ways to reduce risk to the patients, which meets the MDR expectations, right? So let's really, from a packaging standpoint, there's not a lot of changes that really affect the packaging. There are a lot of labeling changes, but the packaging per se, there's not a lot of new requirements. And so therefore, focus on the requirements and back onto ISO 11607 is a good way to do it in practice, especially the newer document which has a lot of the new updates and that harmonizes it. And just be aware that the risk assessment in 11607 isn't meeting the expectations, so you might have to do more from there. All of us are in this together, like we said and earlier, and many companies are having the same challenges and problems from interpretation to application, and let's just work on this together. And the thing is that people tend to overcomplicate it. Well, let's just try to keep it simple at first, and then and try not to overcomplicate it. And want to give a special shout out to Terry Wagner in particular, because he's really done a good job of presenting the key information to the industry and educating a lot of us. And we're just an extension of really a lot of good work that he's done and put into this. But also to the Sterile Barrier Association, again, their hard work in putting out documentation and help and guidance documents for people. Really appreciate those. I want to throw out a special thanks to those organizations and people.
I agree, Geoff. Yeah, I think both have done a really good job today. They're really good. Very informative information on both sides there.
Okay, thank you, Geoff and Tommy, for your explanations on these points and also for answering already some questions in between the webinar. So we have some time left to answer some questions from the audience. I see questions coming in already, but you can still do that in the Q&A section below. Let's start with a question that came in. You talked about notified bodies that were going to be held more accountable. In what way would we see that?
Yeah, Geoff, I can give you a break if you want.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so again, from an engineer's perspective, keep that in mind. Supervision of notified bodies will change considerably. I think we all know that at this stage. And it's going to start basically with the requirement that they apply for a new designation. And as a result of that, it's expected that a significant number of notified bodies may not be re-notified or may be notified for a different scope, which could force manufacturers to change notified bodies. So I think that's important to note. Unannounced audits and manufacturers of authorized representatives, I feel that will increase. I think it's a given. Audit schedules will have to be provided to the national authorities ahead of time as well, which is also an important note. In addition to that as well, the notified bodies they'll be required to consult with the European Commission on the adequacy of the notified bodies' clinical evaluation and post-market clinical follow-up plans prior to the notified body granting the actual certificates. So that's another important note.
Right, and I guess some just additional comments. If you think through that too, is that the purpose of the medical device regulation, right, is also driving patient safety, but it's doing it also through, like we said, a risk analysis of including the complete life cycle and post-market analysis of that. So that's going to be a new depth of questioning and assessments that is going to be asked of medical device manufacturers. And that's what you just mentioned too, is where it's going to be looked at from the European Commission as well, by the from the notified bodies as well.
Yeah, I think personally the way that the notified bodies basically will have to reapply, I think that's going to be a big thing. It's going to be a big thing for MDMs, because it's going to shake things up. Because I suppose you currently have that relationship with that notified body and you've had it for years, and now potentially you're going to have to switch. So that's going to be, I think, a big shake-up in the industry.
Okay, thank you for your answers, guys. I have another question coming in. You talked about the last mile versus the transportation to the hospital in one of the slides. what are some variables that are different in those two aspects?
Well, that's a big question, but let me start with, we know at a high level what the effects are on packaging. For example, shock, vibration, and compression, and those have been well documented in mapping through the rail, truck, and airplane distributions as environments, and therefore simulated tests like ASTM D4169, for example, have been developed around these studies, and the packaging systems are designed by packaging engineers to withstand these types of simulated hazards. But in the hospital environment, it's where the primary packaging is often separated and removed from the protective packaging. And that happens often at the hospital receiving area. And then it's either combined with other devices in a box or stored on a shelf with other packaging on top of it or turned on their sides without the protective packaging. This isn't really studied very well and understood. And in the last few years, it's become highlighted to look at that type of, that last mile or 100 feet or whatever you want to call it in the industry, because the packaging dynamics or the packaging designs weren't necessarily designed to be without the protective packaging when you expose them to hazards, dropping and those types of hazards in the hospital environment. And so it's really highlighted the fact that, we need to look at those and start to study those more and consider those more. So temporarily, what people have been doing to react to that, for example, and the questions are really, really good is what do you do to design for this, et cetera. And it really has to be with temporarily some packaging engineers are going far to an extreme and saying, hey, what we're going to do is test shock and vibration on devices in their primary packaged configuration. And I think that's an extreme, and it really is, not necessarily realistic to the environment in the hospital. But I think that generates a question in the industry that we need to think about what are we going to do to map or study that environment. So there are a lot of key groups in the industry that are starting to talk about this and address this and thinking about it, and what needs to be done is task force need to be pulled together and to start to look and understand this type of environment. And really what I expect to be the outcome of that is that there are so many variables between hospitals in that environment. So therefore, what is probably likely to do is a study of the hospital environment, the last mile, the last 100 feet, and then those considerations and those things that are found in those studies are going to probably be put into guidance documents available for packaging engineers in the industry. So a guidance document for this will be, additional things to consider for that last mile, if you will.
So really, Geoff, we could potentially see a shake-up in the D4169 standard.
It could be there. It could be actually applied in ISO 11607, for example.
Yeah, that's true, actually. Yeah, it could be there too, yeah. But yeah, it's a really good question, actually.
Sorry. We've got another question coming in about the labeling on the boxes. So we have to use the symbols on the sterile barrier packaging. Is there also a requirement on the boxes? Do they need to be labeled with any symbol, or is it okay to just have the sterile barrier inside labeled?
I'll just jump out, and I would have thought that it's just the packaging, the primary packaging would have to be labeled. I'm not sure, does the label on the shipper have to include the same information that's on the primary? I would have thought no. What would you think, Geoff?
I know that there's a lot of debate on that, and that's a common question that people are asking in the industry. Obviously, on the shipper, it doesn't need to be there, but there is still some debate on whether it needs to be on cartoning. But absolutely on the contents within the carton, for sure, because that's where you make a decision on whether it's what is sterile or not, and what can go into a sterile field or not.
It nearly relates back to the last question, Geoff, you know, when it actually gets to the hospitals as well, like, you know, it gets taken out of the shipper and it gets put on the shelf. So if it's taken out of the shipper, that's kind of lost then, you know, because the shipper is no longer there. It's just on the shelf. So definitely the primary, but yeah, it's a good question.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for one last question. Are there documents that will be added in MDR compared to the ISO 11607, so validation documents, or should it just contain more detail, or how do the expectations change in MDR?
Yeah, you know, like as Geoff clearly said earlier on, Annika, you know, validated packaging, it's a current requirement, so nothing really has changed, you know, and from a visual inspection of packaging prior to use is obviously, as we all know, important. However, the user will have only, you know, has a very limited time to kind of assess and to detect for, let's say, breaches of integrity. So, you know, that time is really limited. So, in my opinion, at least, the visual inspection will never be 100% verification, and it should be considered only really a risk mitigation measure. And for those reasons, that's why there's a strong focus will be on the design control and the subsequent design validation. And that will include evidence that those validations that have been completed and documented, basically that the package will meet the form, fit and function as set out in the specification.
And I guess just an additional thing that we mentioned earlier too is this is also another opportunity. Working with nurses and nursing panels and discussion with those, there's a lot of there's some commonality that they understand and basics about packaging, but it's also a good opportunity for them to help them to understand, you know, what to look for and you know, to what will compromise a package and what is good or bad in, as far as packaging failure modes.
Okay, thank you guys. Well, as it turns out, we do have time for another question. Is the usage of the SBS symbol mandatory in MDR, or is the suggestion?
I'd have said it's mandatory. Yeah.
Mandatory.
That's a very clear answer.
Snap.
Yeah. Well, if you think about it too, you know, how do you know? And if you don't know, with a double packaging configuration that's introduced to the operating room, for example, how do you know if the inside package is actually sterile and should be crossing over into the sterile zone? So it really is important at that point, especially the overall, and it ties into the overall objective to increase patient safety or risks to patients. And we know that microbial contamination of the sterile field is one of the biggest risks.
Okay, thank you very much. I have one more question on ISO 11607. As you said, it's pretty much the same for MDR. It does not really change much as we do it right now, but only the risk management needs to be changed. I think you already said it, but somebody is checking if they understood that correctly.
Correct. 11607 was really harmonized with the Medical Device Directive. When the Medical Device Regulation came out, it added some new features and a lot of new regulation, and a lot of that has already been considered and incorporated into the 2019 version released at the beginning of last year of ISO 11607. So that is correct. Sections like the manufacturer sections were added, and bits and pieces throughout the document were added to cover gaps between the MDD and the MDR and incorporated into ISO 11607. But you're right, even though there is talk about risk mitigation at a high level in ISO 11607 in the newest version, the European Commission says that's not far enough. We want to push that the risk mitigation even further. And so that's why there's a disagreement. And that will be worked on by the ISO working groups in the future.
Okay, thank you very much for confirming that. And with that, I also want to end this webinar. I want to thank Geoff and Tommy for their explanation on this topic and everybody that joined for their attention. If we didn't get to your question yet, we apologize for that, but you feel absolutely free to reach out to us. You can do that on our website or through this email address. We will also send you a recording afterwards by email, so you can reply to that email too if you still want to discuss some of the topics that we touched today. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I wish you a very nice day.